So, how to build neuroinclusive workplaces. We're going to be looking at legal responsibilities and meaningful support. We're really excited about the session today, being able to collaborate with Thrive Law, and I will introduce Laura shortly. But yeah, really exciting to be able to go through and kind of talk about some of these kind of key areas, particularly in Neurodiversity Celebration Week. So, over to Laura.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. So just very briefly, a little bit about me. So I am a solicitor practicing employment law. I've been practicing for about over 15 years now. I hate to remind myself of that fact, it makes me feel old, but it's true. And inclusivity and neuroinclusion in particular is something I've felt very passionate about my whole career, really, both from a personal and a professional perspective. And I'm very fortunate at Thrive Law, we offer employment law services, but with that ED&I and an employee wellbeing lens. So we are known for our work in terms of championing mental health, diversity, equity and inclusion in all aspects of our work. And we are very fortunate to get involved with consultation on legislation, but also with ACAS as well in terms of their guidance. We've recently been a case study for them as part of their neurodiversity awareness piece. So all interesting things we get to be involved with. And I'm really happy to be collaborating with Matthew today on this webinar with you all.
Thank you, Laura. And so, yeah, my name's Matthew, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Aim Forward. I've been working for over 20 years in the neurodiversity and disability sectors, experience working with both workplaces as a whole, and then also individuals in those workplaces, and also in education settings. My main passion is enabling people to perform to their best, and whether that's through supporting larger organisations and workplaces themselves to support those people, or directly and individually with those people themselves. We, as Aim Forward, are an industry-leading provider of essentially assessments, so it's diagnostic assessments. We deliver workplace needs assessments, and we also deliver coaching and training, trying to create personalised strategies to learn and work your way. And we can help you on your kind of inclusivity journey, supporting neurodivergence, but then also mental health, physical health, and sensory impairments as well. So, introducing the session today, what we're hoping for is to provide some kind of background information around neurodiversity, some of the language that's used, a little bit of kind of understanding around strengths and challenges in the workplace, and then also kind of definitions of what is a disability and what are reasonable adjustments. But throughout that process, we really want to be able to then look at what does actual support look like, what does a neuro-inclusive culture look like, and how do you embed and build those neuro-inclusive processes and policies into your workplaces. So hopefully it's both informative and then actually practical as well. We'll spend a little bit of time at the end taking questions. So throughout the session today, you should be able to ask questions. There should be the chat facility. The questions will come through anonymously, and we'll be able to take them. Hopefully at the end, if there's anything that comes through, we will throughout it. But at the end of the session, we'll be able to take some of those Q&As, and then we'll also there's a few polls as well that we'll pop in as we go. So hopefully we'll be able to take you through. So I'm going to hand over to Laura next, and I'll put on a little poll as well as we're doing that, just to get a bit of feedback from yourselves.
Matthew. So let's start with what is neurodiversity. So I think commonly we think of the conditions such as ADHD, dyslexia, autism, dyspraxia. And really, in terms of neurodiversity, it's basically different ways in which our brains work. And I always quite like the analogy. So if we think about our brains as different human operating systems, so if you think about an Apple Mac and your PC, if you try and use your Mac mouse with the PC, it's not going to work. And similarly, if you try to download any PC software to a Mac, it's going to have a meltdown. Is it broken? No, it's not. It's just a different way of working and processing. And it's just like our neurodivergent brains in that respect, and the difference between the neurodivergent brains and neurotypical brains. So all absolutely can perform perfectly. It's just different ways in terms of how they process information. And I think more broadly, it's thinking of in the concept of this isn't something that's wrong with somebody, it's an integral part of that person. So for example, if you take away someone's dyslexia, for example, you're taking away part of them. It's how they function and how they think and process things.
Absolutely. And I think it's important as well to understand some of this language. I think managers and leaders can feel a little bit nervous of using the right language or the wrong language. And also with regards to the differences between neurodiversity and neurodivergence, and then disability as well. So we're not touching on mental health, physical health, sensory impairments here. And we'll kind of explain some of that as we go through. But in terms of being able to kind of support all areas, it is super important. But hopefully this gives you an understanding of the terminology with regards to neurodiversity itself.
That's right. I think that's right in terms of using the correct language, specifically. So commonly we hear people say, you know, understandably, something like lack of understanding or otherwise. If people like someone's neurodiverse, well, actually, the correct form of terminology says someone is neurodivergent. So neurodiversity specifically is the noun basically that describes the diversity or variation of cognitive functioning in people. Everybody's got a unique brain and therefore different skills, abilities, and needs. And if we think about what is neurodiverse, that's the adjective that describes that diversity and variation of cognitive functioning people. And I think we've got a second slide, Matthew, haven't we, in terms of some of the terminology as well. So we mentioned there about neurodivergent, and that describes people who have a neurodivergence. And I know there's a lot of those variations on the theme there, but it can be helpful, especially if you have neurodivergent members of your team, to have a correct understanding of the language we use. But as Matthew said, don't be afraid to use it. But if this is helpful, we've just popped up some of the more common terms here.
Yeah, and I think it's really common to use neurodiversity where you might use words like disability, and it's the understanding that the difference is there. An individual might say, I have a neurodiversity. Technically, that isn't the right terminology, but it's about having that awareness and maybe not being too afraid of saying the wrong thing. I think I've worked in this sector for 20 years, and it's still, prevalent from myself to not feel that I know exactly the right thing to say all the right times. So in terms of what are the benefits of having a neurodiverse team, I think if you're looking at how to build a neurodiverse or neuroinclusive culture and workplace, then you really need to start with what are the benefits of that. So why should we do that? Why are we investing in this process? In terms of statistics and backing up the benefits and reasons for it, one of the first ones really is centered around productivity. So the latest statistic, I think was from Deloitte, was 30% more productive workforce if it is neurodiverse rather than a neurotypical workforce. So there's really clear benefits in terms of productivity. You'll see increased creativity, different ways of thinking about things, different ways of approaching problems and finding solutions. The latest stat was something like saving of around a really interesting article, saving £40 million through looking at different ways of doing things for a single company. Having those unique perspectives, if you're looking at from a recruitment perspective, I think it's easy for individuals to look at recruiting and bringing in team members who are like themselves. But actually, you need those unique perspectives. You need to have that diverse team in terms of getting those results. If you looked at maybe crude footballing analogy of you don't really want a team of 11 strikers, you need people to do different jobs in the team. It'll be different midfielders, attackers, etc. It's about being able to have those unique perspectives. And then ultimately that diverse culture, it doesn't bring just productivity benefits, it also brings retention, well-being, everyone feels supported in that kind of process. I'm sure that Laura and the team at Thrive see some of those benefits come through as well.
Definitely with the clients we work with, both whether we're advising, whether we're doing training with them, it's definitely, and it's proven in statistics, I think, in terms of inclusive leaderships, it cuts down employee attrition by 76%, which is huge. And what we tend to find is when you have that greater understanding and you have got the people in the right roles and you're recruiting in the right way, you have more collaborative, more innovative, better performing teams. I see we've definitely seen that happening in real life, and I think generally morale is better as well when we have when we're seeing inclusive workplace. And it's quite concerning. You see things like 50% of managers would avoid, they might say they avoid hiring a neurodivergent candidate, when actually we have several studies that prove in terms of the untapped potential of neurodivergent people. And actually, if you're looking in terms of recruitment, 3 out of 4 people will consider your inclusive practice, whether you have an inclusive culture, actually accepting or rejecting a job offer. So it has that wider spread of impact. And as I say, it's only the strengths are proven.
Absolutely, and the numbers obviously are, I think everyone sees in the press in terms of overall individuals being diagnosed, but also that awareness piece and understanding doesn't have to be from a diagnostic perspective. It can also be in terms of that lived experience as well, in terms of the touch that neurodiversity and neurodivergence is having on people. Having a workplace and an organisation that is supportive of that helps far more people than I think people realise. It's not a small number of individuals that we're looking at and supporting here. Strengths in the workplace. I think it's really important to focus in on what strengths are brought with having a neuroinclusive workforce, and what neurodivergent conditions, the strengths that they bring to the workforce, because it can quite often be looked at from a weakness or kind of difficulty or barriers. Some of the work that we do ourselves, and I think Thrive experience, is that we might engage with a client or a team whereby there might be perceived weaknesses. And I think that the best work that we do is really when it's strengths at the fore, and so that we get brought in to look at, right, here's the strengths, there may be some barriers alongside that, and how do we look at removing some of those barriers or supporting some of those areas, but really championing those strengths. Some people might not feel that they're able, have previously been able to champion those strengths, and fitting into a workplace and engaging with a workplace that is inclusive will really champion these strengths, and that is super positive, and supports all areas from productivity through to well-being. In terms of the challenges that might be experienced through a neurodivergent condition, I think that being able to have that confidence, then if you're supported from a strength area, then you might be more confident to feel that you can disclose areas of difficulty. You might be more likely to disclose your neurodivergence, or you might disclose a disability, that then can start to look at areas that are more challenging, and having those open two-way conversations with the line manager, rather than the line manager directing what should be done, being able to listen to some of those challenges alongside the strengths is a much more positive and effective way of embedding support and making sure that some of those challenges are either removed or supported. It could be assistive technology, it could be one-to-one support, it could be coaching, but it could be really small little adjustments in lighting, or with regards to being able to access headphones during work times, or from a sensory perspective. Anything else from your side, Laura, in terms of some of those strengths and kind of challenges seen throughout?
No, I think it's really important to be aware of these, and how we can sometimes see these presenting is that someone might be appearing like they're disinterested, they're zoning out, they're being overly sensitive to things, and actually what's happening behind the scenes is they're struggling in a neurotypical environment to actually, or without the appropriate support, as Matthew's touched on, with these exact challenges. So that's why we'll come on to it, to talk about this throughout the rest of the webinar, in terms of having that conversation with individuals to understand these. And if we can do that, then and they're appropriately supported, then obviously you can help to remove those challenges might be struggling with.
Absolutely. And also, just to, I think, touch on it, but just to re-emphasize that people might feel uncomfortable about disclosing some of these things. It's not something that you want to put on your CV necessarily, but if the workforce and workplace, the culture there is supportive, then it's much more likely to be able to start those conversations. And then also an acknowledgement from a line manager perspective. This is difficult, it's hard, it's sensitive conversations, and being able to have that confidence to not necessarily get it perfectly right every time or right from the start, being able to know kind of areas to go and how best to support those individuals. So I'll let Laura just talk through a little bit about kind of what is a disability and the kind of the definitions around that.
I certainly wouldn't be doing my job properly if we didn't have a bit of law in here today. So just looking at the legal definition of what is a disability for employment law purposes. So why this is important. Obviously, we talk about the inclusive nature, it's important to support these individuals, but obviously what we're also looking to do is to prevent any risk of a claim for discrimination as well. So, excuse me, a disability is a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial long-term adverse effect on the ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities, so outside of the workplace as well, and how that impacts that person. And when we talk about substantial, it has to be more than minor or trivial, have a more minor or trivial effect on that person. And it's quite wide ranging. So it can include mental health conditions, and neurodevelopmental and learning conditions might satisfy this test. There are some health conditions, just to touch on it very briefly, that automatic disabilities such as cancer and MS. And importantly, what's really important to consider here in terms when we're talking about the effect of that individual, it's the impact it has on them without medication. So someone might disclose to you that they have a neurodivergent condition, but actually it's it can be largely appropriately managed through medication. But what we're looking at in terms of whether it qualifies as a disability is what is the impact of their condition on them without that medication. And I think something we commonly get asked, actually, it's really important to note, is actually the impairment doesn't have to be a diagnosed condition. I think it's quite commonly known now that actually an individual might be looking to get support from their GP. It can take up to 2 years for someone to get a formal diagnosis of ADHD, for example. So what we don't want to do is sit back and not do anything. I think, well, we haven't got done anything for you because you haven't proven to us that that you have a neurodivergent condition. It's really important to just hear what your employee is telling you, and that they and then the challenges they're facing, so they can support those. Because the employment tribunals, we see they're very quick to impart knowledge on an employer to satisfy the test for disability. So could that employer have reasonably expected to have known that individual had a disability? So I say diagnosis isn't something that's automatically required. And then thinking about whether a condition is long-term and substantial. So it's something that an individual has suffered from or is likely to suffer from for more than 12 months. And obviously, neurodivergent conditions are lifelong conditions, no cure for them. So, in majority of cases, it's going to satisfy this test. And we need to think about the cumulative effects. So for example, ADHD might trigger anxiety. Anxiety might then trigger depression. And there are some conditions that are progressive as well.
And I think that it's important to think of, when we're having some of these conversations and looking at it from a medical perspective, an example might be if you break your arm, that does have significant impact, but it might not necessarily have the long-term impact in terms of there is a period of healing. Therefore, that wouldn't be classed as a disability, whereas a diagnosis, for example, of dyslexia would be due to that long-term nature and that day-to-day impact. And I think also in terms of that understanding and in terms of terminology of disability, as managers and leaders start to increase their knowledge and awareness and understanding, I think it's important also not to just look at kind of key or kind of typical characteristics or traits of that condition, and understand actually some of the less known and potentially wider impacting areas of some of those conditions. So, for example, with regards to ADHD and criticism sensitivity, it isn't a choice. It's not like, oh, this person is being sensitive around this area of feedback. It's actually that long-term, ongoing impact of that criticism sensitivity that I think managers and leaders might benefit from having that support and knowledge around, which external support can help with as well.
Yeah, another thing legally as well, if we have someone who meets the definition for disability under the Equality Act 2010, and there's a legal obligation on the employer to make reasonable adjustments. So what we're looking to do here is to remove or minimise any disadvantages experienced by that individual, and to allow them to function their role as if they didn't have the disability. So putting them on a par with others, for example, and they must be reasonable and refusal any refusal of them must be objectively justified. If there's a reason why you're saying, well, practically we can't make X or Y adjustment, being able to demonstrate why that's justifiable. It's not just we can't rely on the cost of making adjustments. And I think we talk a lot here about communication and speaking to the individual, and obviously seeking the appropriate technical and medical support as well to understand, but it's understanding how the challenges they're facing. So if someone comes to you and just says, right, yeah, I think I've got I think I've got ADHD and I need this, and this. It's just pausing for a minute to understand, okay, probably let me understand, how does that impact you? How do you feel it's going to impact you in your role? What support would you benefit from? So having a conversation around that to draw that out. And I suppose it's making sure that if you are in a leadership or a management role, that you have the confidence to have those conversations, that you're getting the appropriate support to be able to do that sensitively and appropriately, and understand what the individual is saying they need and why, and how it will help to support them.
Yeah, I think that having those conversations and not necessarily having, I think there's a little bit of fear, particularly if the knowledge and understanding isn't there. So if you're an SME owner or in a smaller team, being able to have some of these conversations without that fear of, I'm just going to have to automatically put that in place if someone's asking for it. It's a yes or a no. I think it's really important to explore first, start to create that list, as Laura says, but then be able to know that that's not just set in stone, that things do get reviewed, and the adjustments aren't not just a kind of fixed thing. It's important for it needs to be appropriate for the company as well as the individual, and it's that two-way conversation to look at what is appropriate. And I think there's a bit of fear of that sometimes, and trying to reduce some of that fear and support that from a leadership perspective, I think can be really helpful. So what would some examples of reasonable adjustments look like? I think there's definitely a fear around reasonable adjustments as being very expensive, but I'm sure that Laura and ourselves see there are lots of opportunities to implement adjustments that have no cost at all, and would benefit and support lots of people, not necessarily just neurodivergent individuals. And I think some of these areas as well do help everyone. I think if you start to put in some of these policies across the organisation, and you see benefits for everyone and that kind of productivity and well-being gains. How do you find, Laura, in terms of some of the questions that might be asked about, like, the lines of what is reasonable and what is not, what's an appropriate adjustment for certain clients in the workplace? How do you find individuals approach that conversation?
I think it's really bespoke to the individual and also the organisation as well. So what one, employer or size business might be able to accommodate, another might struggle. It depends on the type of role as well. So there are all these intricacies you need to having a think about. I think things like, for example, being flexible about hours. For example, I know my brain is much fresher and better in the morning, so I have some flexibility about that in terms of what time I might finish. I know in my time management, I have support with that in terms of doing my hefty work at the start of the day, having that quiet space, and actually, talking on the point of environment. Actually, one thing that we do speak to a lot of clients about, actually, in terms of their recruitment practices in particular. So obviously you've got your existing staff, but equally you need to be thinking about people when you're in your recruitment practices as well. So we've had a lot of conversations about thinking about the environment you're interviewing. Obviously, everyone's a bit nervous when they go to interviews. You want to get the best out of that person. They want to be able to bring their best selves to you, whether they feel comfortable disclosing that they are neurodivergent or not. But if we're going to bring them into a meeting room with incredibly bright lights, it's white, it's quite enclosed spaces, that's really going to trigger someone who's neurodivergent. They're going to struggle in that environment. So thinking about asking, whilst we're not going to necessarily ask them, oh, have you got a medical condition? Can you tell us now before we interview you? We don't want to be saying that per se, but I think everybody would benefit from a question such as, is there anything that we can do to support or that you would need from in terms of the interview process, for example? And that, again, I think that's a really good leading point to show that you have that open culture as well. I think, I feel quite careful there. Someone's asked me what I might, the environment that I would better benefit from. And you're going to get the best out of that person. You're going to get the best candidate for the role. You're going to see the best from them. And similarly, that then trips into when they're actually working for you. Some of these things are actually quite simple to implement. But yeah, in terms of the, to go back to the original question, there's no short answer in terms of what's reasonable. Yes, financial side of things is one thing to consider, but it's whether it's going to remove that disadvantage that person's struggling from. So that understanding of that is going to be key to start with, and understanding that to be reasonable, it's got to help and to remove that disadvantage to support that individual in carrying out their role.
And I also think that in terms of part of that disclosure as well, I think sometimes managers or leaders outside of the sector or the space can feel worried in terms of, how do I benefit all of my team rather than a specific individual? That is a slight concern from them. We have never, we don't see that from our side. I think I get asked quite a lot, how do I help this person? And will this person feel like they're being unfairly treated? Who sits opposite them or next to them or what have you? But we never see that feeling within organisations, or very rarely see that feeling. And also an awareness that individuals and employees don't want to be reasonably adjusted. I don't want to have adjustments made for me. I want to feel accepted and encouraging to the company as I am. I might ask for certain things, or I'm good at these areas, or less confident in these areas. So I think being aware of like the terminology that we use around whether it's disability or reasonable adjustment, it might not necessarily be the most kind of friendliest terms in the world, but it's about having those conversations and starting to ask these questions and removing some of those kind of slight barriers of kind of language and listening. But then also in terms of if reasonable adjustments are policies, how do you actually then turn those policies into real life? What do they look like in the real world of kind of day-to-day activities? It's very easy to have one policy that then just sits in a folder or a drawer that never gets kind of brought out. Being able to give leaders and managers that confidence to put those things in place, that it's just to live and breathe a lot more. That's the best way of kind of building an inclusive environment.
Really. Yeah, I just wanted to briefly mention this. So our managing partner, Jodie Hill, which some of you may be aware of, and the good work that she does, she's recently consulted with the ACAS's new guidance on neurodiversity at work. And I popped a link to it here because it's a really useful resource. So it breaks down some of the common neurodivergent conditions and how to support that, and from a legal perspective as well. So if you haven't looked at it already, I'd encourage you to do that. But it's a really helpful for resource. And as I've used Thrive Law as a bit of a case study as well for supporting. So some helpful information there if you haven't already seen it.
And yeah, I'd just back that up by saying it's a fantastic piece of work and really helpful in terms of being able to spread some of these theories and processes. So moving into a lot of knowledge that we've kind of talked through and information that we've gone through previously, but how do you actually then start to build that culture? One way is obviously to embed the things that we've talked about and increase that knowledge. Another way might be actually accessing some external support. If you're building a new website, for example, you might want to get external web builders to come in to support that process. So with regards to things like assessments and coaching, you can bring in diagnosticians, so bring in diagnostic assessments or needs assessments, workplace needs assessments, and coaching, so that you are supported by experts in embedding and building these cultures. So what do diagnostics assessments do? So in terms of the diagnostic process, some individuals would like and benefit from a diagnostic assessment. So for example, dyslexia, could be autism or ADHD. Other people prefer to actually not have that formal diagnosis in place. They don't want to go through that process, or they don't want to have that label, and being able to still access certain support or reasonable adjustments is also important. So that's whereby the next stage could be a workplace needs assessment. So you might have a formal diagnosis or you may not. And a workplace needs assessment looks at your kind of work work life and work tasks, and breaks them down to look at strategies and support. And we'll come on to workplace assessments just next. All the way through to then coaching and turning like new habits or new strategies into action. So it's very easy to have a new piece of assistive technology or AI or a piece of software put onto your machine. How do you actually embed that and build that into your kind of day-to-day activity so that you get the benefit from that? And I always like to look at these areas in terms of supporting the individual, so through assessments and coaching, as the kind of building blocks for that neurodiverse, neuroinclusive workplace, so that from the top down you can look at policies, but then also embedding support for the individuals then puts that through the organisation really naturally. So if you're able to offer diagnostic assessments, if you're able to offer workplace needs assessments, you can both get the benefit of them all the way through to actually your staff feel much more supportive and it feels like you're thinking and essentially caring about their needs and how to support them best, and also look at their kind of productivity. So just to touch into what a workplace needs assessment is or does, it kind of pulls all of the building blocks that we're talking about here in terms of creating that inclusive culture, pulls that into like the individual. So it listens to the individual. So there'll be a period of time to talk through what is the diagnosis, what are the potential traits, what's the potential impact, what does that diagnosis mean for that individual, and then breaks down their workplace work and work tasks so that it looks at composition or time management or the actual environment itself, and then recommends strategies from that. So if you're a line manager and you're working with an individual who has disclosed a neurodivergence or a disability, and you don't know how best to support them, then you might access a workplace needs assessment so that that individual is has been assessed by an expert in the field, so that they're able to look at the best strategies for the individual, but also the line manager gets that support as well, so that they know, following the report, that actually the right adjustments are in place and the right support is in place to enable that individual to be their most productive, but also looking at kind of well-being and making sure that they're happy from a retention perspective is also really helpful. So if we're talking about building blocks through external support, how does all of this kind of map in together in terms of creating that kind of neuro-inclusive culture? And what can you do as an organisation? What are the kind of key takes from this? And I'm sure that Laura has some thoughts on that as well. But I think together these are the kind of key 4 areas that we would probably look at in terms of being able to start to embed that. And so for me, I think that starting with core building block to any of this is to be able to listen and understand, and so being able to listen to an individual's experience and their take and their views and how they feel that it might be best supported, but then also to show like genuine interest in that, and that spreads not just in the individual conversations but across the company as a whole. And then I think from Laura's side, I'm sure that educating yourself is super important as well.
And that's really, this can be twofold really. So depending on the level of knowledge, understanding, and the stage that your individual employees at in terms of their diagnosis, they may be able to share a wealth of knowledge, understanding, and certainly understanding how they, what support they would require, and also their knowledge of the condition. Or broadly, there's so many different resources you can go to get more information. And actually speaking to the individual to say, well, actually, would you work with us to actually raise that awareness and knowledge elsewhere on your whole staff team? I think really we're talking here about a culture, so that's that broader piece of really embedding that. What's your vibe? What does your business want to say about how you like to work with your staff? And I think once you start that ball rolling in terms of showing, like Matthew said there, about listening and empathizing and understanding properly, what you'll tend to find is that openness and that positivity will only spread. And what you're actually doing is helping that individual at the same time to be the best performing employee they can be as well. So you get the productivity out of that. But from the education perspective, I think it can help you, and it helps improve confidence as well when you have that greater understanding. So that combination of speaking to the individual themselves concerned, getting that broader support and awareness of knowledge, whether that's you bring someone in to do the training specifically for you, whether you go to those external resources, and helping to share that. And again, those open conversations will certainly follow, and we certainly see that happening in practice with our clients as well.
Absolutely. And that brings me on to, I'm just going to release another poll, which is around like what role do you have at work? Because different roles can do different things, but if what we're talking about here in terms of that overall key points, that filters through the organization, but different roles can bring different things into that mix, so that together it creates that and builds that inclusive culture. And so talking about inclusive and correct language, I think obviously it's super important to not use offensive or discriminatory language, but I think it's also important to be mindful of the much more subtle language or subtle behaviors that we might experience in the workplace or in meetings. So for example, if you're in a meeting and an individual with autism might be struggling with people talking over the top of them, or that they don't feel as though they can get their point across quickly enough in enough space because the meeting is too large, or the more dominant voices are talking over them. How do you approach that? And so that's from a language perspective, but then also from a kind of behavioural perspective as well. Things like inappropriate jokes in those meetings, and that kind of like stepping into like banter. What is appropriate, what is not, and just being much more aware of that impact. Anything else from your side, Laura, in terms of like that more kind of challenging exclusionary behaviour?
Yeah, this is really important. And in terms of the key building blocks, we're going to start with your policies. So that will set the tone. If we're using them the right way, you know, it's quite common to see these folders in the cupboards somewhere. Yes, we've got the key policies we need, but I think they're a really useful tool, again, to set that tone of your business. It's one of the first documents you'll share with someone who you're onboarding in terms of joining the team. So it's what they understand about what is the culture here, who am I joining, what am I investing my time in here. So having the policies to refer back to, it also helps anyone who's looking to manage any processes to have a point of reference, understand properly what your policies, processes and procedures are. And then beyond that, like we set out here, it's challenging those. So leading by example, excuse me, and doing the do's basically. So you've got your policies there. And it's that wider piece of promoting. I think the key words here for are respectful and inclusive environment. So it's professionally respectful, you know, and setting, being clear what's considered to be appropriate and what is inappropriate. And as I say, demonstrating that. I mean, your worst case scenario, if someone has really crossed the line, it turns to a conduct issue. Again, it might follow a disciplinary process, for example. Again, having that policy and procedure there in the first place to follow it through. But even if it's just something that that's a comment in a meeting, is being seen to be addressing and challenging that. So the person who it may have been either might be sensitive to that comment, or it may even have been worst case scenario aimed at, sees they're being stood up for, has value in that, but also the wider team as well understands and sees the support that they're given. And again, that's going to have a positive outcome as well in the broader sense of the word.
Absolutely. And I think that some of that dialogue certainly from a leadership perspective, being able to obviously support those policies, but then to facilitate and give confidence to other leaders and managers to be able to start to have these conversations, and between all employees, to be able to give that confidence that, yeah, the policies are here, this is not okay outside of that. But then to be able to promote and give that confidence to start some of these, so to start listening, to start educating, to start using the right language, to start challenging exclusionary behaviour without the fear of like, oh, I might say something wrong, or I might trip myself up, or being able to kind of lead by that example, I think is really important. And you can start to have some of those conversations and not feel like it's all about perfectionism, some of these processes are short steps, and along that journey towards building that really inclusive culture, and you're not going to get there without maybe making mistakes, but having that kind of confidence to be able to start some of those conversations, and not that fear of like, I'm going to say the wrong thing and really offend someone.
One thing, and also, yeah, exactly leading on from that, really, one of the things I wanted to touch on was something that we actually use internally at Thrive, and it's become such a popular thing. We mentioned it to a couple of clients. They keep wanting, what's that you're doing? What's your license to Thrive all about? And actually, we're now doing it. We're actually working with clients to create their own. So essentially, what it is, it's a personalised document, and it's something you use as part of your onboarding process. And what it does is it's quite a reflective piece, actually. It's one of the first things we ask anyone new join the team to complete. And it's understanding how they work best, how they communicate effectively, what they feel their strengths are, what they might find challenging. And also, so it gives new starters a voice when they join. As I say, it's quite a personal reflection. There's some fun questions in there as well. But it also, importantly, especially the topic we're talking about today, it's actually a safe space. If someone is neurodivergent and might feel they need some reasonable adjustment, it's a way that they can express what they might need for without any fear of embarrassment, because it's something that everybody completes. And it's a very positive thing. And we all have sight of our colleagues' license to Thrives as well. It helps if you get to have a conversation. So, for example, how I like to receive feedback might not be the way in which my a colleague might. So if I'm sharing something with them, I'll have better understanding of how to approach that conversation, which really helps that communication piece. It's a very light, it's a living document essentially, so it's something we keep up to date as well. But this can be a really useful and simple tool actually to use as part of your onboarding process.
Yeah, and I can certainly second that. In terms of, there's not many times, certainly not in day to day, but you might have some questions around this, like onboarding, but being able to have that opportunity to tell someone or be asked, how do you perceive your work, or how do you what's your lived experience in these areas, is really refreshing, and it feels like, okay, I belong here. People want to know this about me, not from that kind of data perspective, but because they're genuinely interested to understand how I tick. And sometimes actually we see it certainly in our assessments, it's quite an emotional question sometimes when you start to ask some of these things, because people sit there and think, I've not been asked this for maybe ever, or not for 5 years, not since education, or not, and it's a really validating process to be able to be asked some of those questions, and it feels like, okay, this is a safe space, and I'm going to be supported and kind of listened to. So yeah, certainly validate the license to Thrive. So in terms of then the actual, I guess, crux of the webinar itself today, and the title itself of how to actually build that neuro-inclusive workplace. We've gone through kind of educating pieces, but what are the actual kind of practical steps of kind of making that happen? This kind of diagram takes you on that journey that I think that everyone would want to be on, and I'm sure that if you're attending this webinar, then you're very unlikely to be at the exclusion area, but some people do experience that, and it's something that ourselves and Thrive have worked with, and our hope and kind of what we can do, and what we're hoping that companies are doing, is moving that through to tolerance, acceptance, but ultimately it's belonging. It's a process to feel like a little bit like the kind of social and medical models of disability, medical model, social model, and then ultimately it's the celebratory model that everyone should be looking at, and how do you actually then start to embed that into your culture. For me, ultimately, it really starts with that kind of understanding and those questions, but it's delivered really and embraced by leadership. They need that buy-in, and you need accountability by the senior leaders in the organisation, and that can come then through senior leaders, founders, through to HR teams, learning teams, people and culture, being able to kind of champion these processes and that culture. You need to be able to look at policies, and what policies exist at the moment and what policies might be implemented. I'm sure Laura will touch on this in a second, but what is there in terms of from a policy perspective? Where do you want to get to? How do we recruit and onboard and then train and support managers from a kind of neuro-inclusive perspective? And then how do we actually implement adjustments? So we might have a policy for it, but what does actual day-to-day adjustments look like? How do we implement that confidently and accurately? And then how do we, if we're supporting individuals, how do we ensure that that is then kind of fostered, that neuro-inclusive culture is truly fostered, and that we can celebrate things like Neurodiversity Week, for example. Once you've got to a stage whereby some of those things are starting to be embedded and started to be used, it's then really important to monitor, measure, and continue that improvement. But ultimately, it's not a kind of nice thing to have or a nice thing to do. It's really a kind of business critical priority. And so going back to that kind of buy-in perspective of understanding the importance of all this is key. I'm sure, yeah, Laura has sort of thought particularly around policies and how to embed that.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about before, your groundwork is having the appropriate policies in place from, often these are preventive. So obviously, for example, we have anti-harassment policy, we have equal opportunities policy is obviously that more focused and positive approach to what you're culturally, how you support that and celebrate the diversity and variety of thought within your organisation. But it's living and breathing it as well, isn't it? We've highlighted the strengths that having the variety of thought in your team can bring. So it's making sure that we're doing that through supporting, empowering, training managers to be able to really embed that within your organisation to bring that to the fore. And then obviously all the staff teams and addressing those behaviours as we've touched on. And I think that's, even going, obviously we're here today to talk about neuroinclusion in particular, but I think in terms of the broader perspective of inclusivity and everyone feeling welcomed and happy at work, we spend 90%, well, majority of us still spend 90% of our time at work. So if we can work in an environment that's positive, we're only going to get, as I say, the best out of individuals and the best productivity at the same time.
Absolutely. And I think there's lots of things that organisations can do and are doing. I think that, as I say, attending today is super positive and shows that the path that the attendees here are on. I think sometimes, there's that fear of like, where do I even start? But I think that this quote, in terms of the take of starting small, it is really important, and being able to take those small steps, those taking one piece at a time. So it could be, okay, we review our policies, or we need to be able to send a management team to a training course, or just being able to pick, like, here's some quick wins, here's some key blocks in that process, and then being able to build from there, one thing at a time. And that's where it can kind of come into like ED&I strategy. How do we actually embed this? How do we look at this moving forward? Because it is a big piece of work there, but it could be delivered small and at a steady pace in-house, or actually that's where you might come to external support, whether that be from a legal perspective through Thrive, or through like workplace needs assessments with AIM. Bringing in external support can really support and kind of improve that, the speed of that building process. But I think it is important to feel like, those steps can be taken, but it isn't too daunting. It absolutely can be done. So I think that we're just about in a time window. First off, thank you again for attending and listening to the session today. We will have the recording will be sent out, and the notes and annotation as well of the session will also get sent out, and you'll be able to access that. We'll have a short survey as well after the session. So in the email there'll be a little link. It's super helpful for us. We're really hoping to be able to design a few more of these webinars, and being able to get your input in terms of what is most helpful and what can be used would be really helpful to get your input. So yeah, if there are any questions, feel free to kind of put them through. And also, if you wanted to get in touch with the team at all, I'll put in some details afterwards so that you can put in some, whether contact us phone or email, both from Thrive or from AIM's perspective, is absolutely fine. One question that yeah, we are sharing the slides. The slides will come through so you get the slides, the audio, and then you'll get the video itself. So that's absolutely fine. One question that we've got through that's a complicated question. We might have touched on this, but in terms of like what is a reasonable adjustment? Like where does that sit, Laura, from your side, in terms of like if you're an SME wanting to put a reasonable adjustment in place, how do you decide what is reasonable and what is not? Big, open, difficult question.
No, it's fine. Well, I think if you're approaching it in the right way, and that's actually to support that individual, so it's understanding, first things first, how someone's particular neurodivergent condition impacts them. It's got to be the starting point. So we understand how they work, how they function, how it's treated and managed, and then what support they would feel that they would benefit from at work. Now, sometimes these are conversations which ideally are happening at the early stage of employment. Commonly we do see it come through actually when we're at a stage of performance management. So perhaps someone hasn't disclosed the fact they have a neurodivergent condition when they've initially joined us, but they might be, again, we talked about the challenges they may face. It comes through actually that they're, from the employer's perspective, well, they're not performing, they're not quite carrying out their role, and actually through that conversation they then disclose, well, actually it's because I struggle with this, I process this differently. So it's taking that step back to understand what the disadvantage is essentially, and then what is reasonable. I think we touched on it earlier, is what will help to alleviate that, to remove that, to enable them to properly carry out their role, and to put them on an even keel. So, and actually what we'll do then, if we then put those appropriate measures in place, if someone then is still struggling at work and there is still performance challenges, then they can be appropriately managed and do your normal performance management process, because what you've done, as I say, is help to remove that initial disadvantage, but hopefully that will resolve the issue in the first place. So it's quite a broad ranging question really in terms of what's reasonable, but that's ideally what we'd look to get to, is will it remove the detriment? And if we can't do, can we objectively justify why we can't put that specific reasonable adjustment in place to be able to evidence demonstrate that?
Absolutely. And one thing that we'll see as well is that just because every individual is individual, particularly for a SME, a small company, what do we do? Because we've not got a blueprint from another example, so that can be quite challenging. Where does that lie? And so
I think the key thing there is it's not necessarily a blueprint, is it? I mean, there's that, someone said to me once, and it really stuck with me, you've met one neurodivergent person, you've still only met one neurodivergent person, because everyone has their own individual challenges and needs. So it's tailoring it to that particular person. And if don't suffer alone as well. There is, as I say, wealth of resource. We've got obviously your service in terms of doing the appropriate needs assessment to gain that insight and knowledge and have it in a digestible and understanding way. So that's you're working with the employee. You've both got that better understanding. I know first experience, sometimes those needs assessments can be quite enlightening as an individual, as well as being really helpful to the employer to have that greater understanding. It doesn't mean we know all these terms, medical professionals. It's about supporting and understanding that what I say, someone's individual needs.
Absolutely, and being able to support the managers in that process as well as the individuals. We've just got another one here in terms of neurodiversity. Does this have to be a formal diagnosis from a medical professional in order to implement reasonable adjustments? And what if they self-diagnose as they believe they are neurodiverse or actually neurodivergent?
Yeah, well, we did touch on this earlier. So yeah, from a legal perspective, so from a legal obligation to make reasonable adjustments. So I hope it's something we should be looking to support as well anyway. But from a legal perspective, having to do that, excuse me, you don't have to have that proven on your piece of paper with a medical diagnosis on it, unless we know that how long some diagnosis can take to obtain. And it's having that reasoned conversation, understanding why that individual might believe that they have a particular neurodivergent condition, where does it come from, how long are they struggling in that way, how does it impact them? Because as I say, does it qualifying as a disability, it's got to meet those legal tests in terms of having that impact on the day-to-day activities, but doesn't specifically require a full medical diagnosis. And indeed, someone might still be going through the system in trying to obtain that, but it's understanding why they might feel that way and what they feel are challenging with, and that will then enable that conversation with regard to any potential reasonable adjustments they might need.
And I think it's an awareness of the different scales as well of diagnosis. So absolutely, no, you don't have to have a formal diagnosis in place, or even to access external support as well in terms of like access to work. It is the experienced traits, but also an awareness of the differences in that diagnosis from an employer perspective. You could have a formal diagnosis of dyslexia, and that's a 30-page, very comprehensive diagnostic report that provides huge amounts of information from a cognitive perspective, but also you could have a letter from a GP diagnosing anxiety that might be either one word or a very short sentence that just says anxiety. So in terms of what do you do with that diagnosis, actually, it's really about the employer and how they're perceiving that either formal diagnosis or potential diagnosis, and what is reasonable to implement. And I think that's where I think a lot of employers feel a bit nervous of like, well, if there's not a formal diagnosis, how do I know that I'm doing the right thing? I definitely don't want to do the wrong thing. It's not necessarily just from it's a cost perspective, I need a formal diagnosis. I think there is a nervousness around not knowing what to do if there isn't a diagnosis in place. And that can where we can kind of come in to help with regards to workplace needs assessment. You're getting an expert to be able to support and actually identify those areas. Cool. Okay. Some nice comments in the chat as well. So thank you for that as well. So yeah, I think unless there's any specific questions, I will move on to just on the final slide and say a huge thank you for everyone who's attended, and thank you to Laura as well for kind of putting this all together and being able to deliver this session. We've got contact details on there. We're going to be sending through a feedback form. We would super appreciate being able to complete that, particularly with regards to like what you found helpful, what you've not, and then also like potential other future webinars that we can do. But yeah, thank you so much, Laura, for your time as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, we look forward to hearing from you guys and seeing you again at future webinars, hopefully. And yeah, just a final note to say thank you again. Yeah, it's been great. If we can answer any questions or if you've got any queries about what we talked about today or any way that we can help, then certainly let us know.
Please reach out.
I always love those little thumbs up and it's always positive. So yeah, hopefully that's been a really helpful session, and yeah, thanks again to everyone involved and everyone attending.
Thank you all.
Wow. Thank you.